When Courtney Ross and I were designing the senior year, the idea was to have this as the climax of your whole education and to effect the transition from adolescent to young adult. So the senior year was designed to talk to you like adults instead of high school students, and to basically give you a university freshman level course. And so I'm talking to you this morning in the same way that I would talk in my freshman humanities course at MIT. So there's a shift in orientation and cognitive style. And you'll notice that all your teachers in grade 12 have doctorates, as they would have to have in university teaching. So this is a big kind of shift. Increasingly, the humanities have begun to be influenced by cognitive science and brain sciences, and so there's a kind of influence in how to design courses and how to interpret even art. The usual split in art used to be that art was touchy-feely and subjective and not real, and reality was science and engineering and facts and hard stuff, and the humanities were soft, girly, touchy-feely stuff. That's just complete nonsense. First of all, in science, a fact is not a hard substance. It's a cultural construction. You can't have a fact without a theory any more than you can have a flame without a global atmosphere. So facts are a very complex, peer group reviewed construction that requires culture. And in that sense, science is as much a cultural construction as art or a symphony. A theory is like a symphony. So when humanity is developing art, we know in terms of cognitive science, this is the beginning of the development of high cognitive capacities. Art is not just a subjective feeling. It's evidence of the development of cognitive levels of awareness and consciousness. So it's a really important step in the evolution of consciousness. Now, those of you as adults were reading the New York Times, or should be, over coffee this morning, and you'll notice there's an article on Paleolithic cave art right there in the science section of today's New York Times. I didn't arrange that, but I'm very grateful. It's a reprint from Nature, which is the world's greatest scientific journal. So most of what the New York Times picks up occurs in Nature or Science. But it's a really interesting article about, there are now cave paintings like this of 30,000 in Indonesia. And so now it's not just Europe, it's beginning to be spread all over. But in the beginning, when these caves were first discovered, there was a sense that, Europe has reached art, and where was art born? Of course, in Europe. And this is an evidence of the more advanced Cromagnon and moving beyond the old, primitive, lowbrow Neanderthal. And increasingly, we're finding in science that there's genetic mixture between Neanderthal and Cromagnon. There isn't this great divide. And recent publications in science are beginning to suggest that some of these early works of art could be Neanderthal as well as Cromagnon. And so this is really causing a lot of cognitive dissonance and shaking up the old story. Now here's a classic example. This guy in the middle, all duded out in his best white man, the great white hunter, is a very famous anthropologist named E. Evans Pritchard. I read him when I was majoring in anthropology at Pomona College ages ago. But notice this posture. He's got these two primitives by the scruff of the neck, and he's like a fisherman holding two big marlins and smiling in pride and dominance. So the whole notion of Europe in the beginning, when anthropology and art history were forming, was conditioned by these imperial modes of discourse of the Belgian Congo, French Equatorial Africa, Tanganyika, and the British Empire. And so with the discovery of cave paintings, they thought they couldn't be that ancient because, they were too really advanced. And there wasn't progression. Chauvet Cave is just as advanced at 30,000 BC as Lascaux is at 17,000, up to 14,000. So the basic myth was, on your left was Cromagnon man with the pronounced supraorbital ridge, the elongated dolichocephalic skull, and here was your noble Cromagnon coming into Europe with his high forearm, his developed frontal lobes and judgment, and these were two great divides and a kind of revolution. But it's basically a kind of imperialistic, racist narrative. Now here you have close to, with Neanderthal artifacts, this is just recently, I think, from Science, the oldest one in El Castillo, Spain. And this is what they've just found. If you read the Times after you leave here, these handprints are what they just found at 30,000 BC in Indonesia and Sulawesi. And here is Peshmerel in France. Now notice this incredible continuity of culture, 39,500 BP and France. Now this is definitely Cro-Magnon, modern Homo sapiens, and this is, Neanderthal. Well, there's obviously a lot of continuity there, and notice here there's a digit missing. So this is clearly the signature of some initiation form. This is a sacrifice of a digit, a presence of your hand saying, I am here, a transition from adolescence to adulthood. We know from the footprints in the cave that the footprints are small. There are some adult footprints, which would make sense in an initiation ritual, because it's the elderly passing on to the young. But for the most part, the footprints are small. And so we have very much the idea that these are initiation rituals, and what is going on here is much more complicated. Now, in the first part of the 20th century, when the French cult art historians were studying these, with the birth of art of where else but in France, so it fell into the European narrative, but there was also a sense of these people are primitive, and this is just sympathetic magic. They're basically putting their dinner on the wall, stabbing it with a spear, hoping to go outside and find their dinner out there in the hunt. So this is all hunting ritual and magic. But the problem is, they're not really painting the animals they eat. They're eating rabbits and reindeer, but not bison, rhinoceros, and aurochs, the great cattle. So something is wrong in this kind of simplistic narrative. So the hunting magic interpretation carrying on well up into the 60s. And then with the revolution, political as well as intellectual, with the emergence of structuralism in Paris with Lévi-Strauss and André Leroi-Gourhan, a Frenchman who applied structuralism to the study of cave painting, they began to see that this was actually a language, a code, basically like yin and yang. There were female symbols of the vulva, and there were male symbols of the phallus, and there seemed to be a signature in which the spear was a kind of male valency, and the vulva picture or the pubic triangle was female. So it was this kind of cosmology of yin and yang, and not simply hunting magic. And so that was because structuralism was all the rage. And then now that we've learned a lot since then about archaeoastronomy and star positions, we're beginning to think that no, this is much more complicated than that. This is really cosmological and not just anthropological. Now here's the continuity. This is definitely Neanderthal, and this kind of tic-tac-toe sign, and here it is in Lascaux. And here you have these other signs and this sort of feather sign. So as much as the images of the animals are important, there's a whole second level, like subtitles in a French movie, that is commenting on the images and making sort of notations or whatever. So it's the kind of origins of sign. So we have symbol and sign So something is going on here, but of course it's our detective job to try to figure out what it is. Now, the importance of caves is, of course, in their migrations into Europe in the Ice Age. Caves could be a place of refuge, but for the most part now, we don't think they really were cave dwellers. They used the caves as kind of ritual centers. And one of the things that they would encounter in the caves of France and Spain is, at the Ice Age time, the great cave bear, who when he stands up is like a polar bear. It's about 2 stories high, a very frightening critter. And so in slaying these animals, there's a kind of sense of trying to take on their power and their magic, and putting on bear clothes for the shaman, creating an altar and using the skull of the cave bear. So we know that this is a kind of religion, and that the animal that they slay, we slay with technology, and then we save the victim with art. So there's this kind of dynamic dialectical process going on that indicates that this is definitely not just simple hunting magic. When I was in Scotland, I met Lawrence van der Post, who is a South African who has written a book called The Lost World of the Kalahari. And in that book, he spent a lot of time among the San Bushmen. And recent genetic science has shown that the genetic origins of our DNA are from the San Bushmen, and they are a kind of skin quality that can fade in the right climate or darken in the appropriate tropical climate. And so there's a kind of flexibility with the San Bushmen, in that they are actually back 100,000 BC, 80,000 BC. They are our ancestral DNA stock. So that now, with scientific studies, we can see that there were 2 migrations out of Africa, an early one with archaic Homo sapiens, and then another one with modern Homo sapiens. And they spread into China and Indonesia, Africa, and then into Europe and down into Spain. But these are the contemporary rock paintings, petroglyphs of the San. And when Lawrence van der Post showed the San Bushmen the pictures of Lascaux, they wept. And they said, oh, these are our lost paintings of our tradition. Now, this presents a real problem because, one, if they've left Africa to go into Europe, if they're still in South Africa, how do they remember over 16,000 years that they have a tradition of paintings up in Europe? But there was an immediate sense of identification and understanding the signs and the symbols. So in one, you see these feathered signs, like this one right here, which fans out. These are fly chasers. If you go to Africa, say I was in Ethiopia, there are 100,000 million flies everywhere because of the cattle. And so if you just stand, you'll just be covered with flies. So everybody walks around with a lion tail to chase the flies away. So what this fly chaser is used as a symbol for a spirit chaser. You chase away the bad spirits if you're having a creation of this ritual space, and you want this to be a beneficent and auspicious space and not one flooded with the demons and monsters of the unconscious. So if you, and well, in a future slide, you'll see the flycatcher is right at the foot of the oryx. So there's a kind of continuity of the symbolism from these South African petroglyphs to the paintings in Europe. Now the question is, of course, when they uncovered the Venus of Willendorf, that this was a woman who was wearing a cap, and that women could have a cap, and then when they're walking around gathering roots and tubers, they could take the cap off and it became a hat, and they could, collect the plants and food to take back to the hearth. But there was a whole sense, very much in Egypt, when they saw the first black African pharaohs, they said, no, 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 Egypt can't be African. There's, this is very clearly just, a misrepresentation. There was an embarrassment because it was putting cognitive dissonance and stress on the imperial racist narrative, which was beginning to collapse. But when a racist imperial narrative collapses, it tends to flip into its opposite. So, for example, you can have a Eurocentric narrative that all culture comes from Europe and everybody else is primitive, or you can have an Afrocentric narrative, especially in the American public school situation, in which flying saucers landed with the Dogon and established their culture as a kind of peace, Peace Corps work, and taught them about the binary star because they all worship the dog star. And you can't see Sirius with the naked eye to see it's a binary star. So how did they know that in ancient Dogon? And that the Dogon influenced the Nubians and influenced the Egyptians. So in the Afrocentric narrative, it's turned just topsy-turvy, and now it's the actual source of the culture is coming from sub-Saharan Africa and not coming out of Egypt and Mesopotamia, and as well with the origins of archaeoastronomy. So when they looked at this picture, here is a Hottentot that was called then, now it's San Bushman, with the characteristic steatopygia, which is the Greek word for this deposit of fat in the buttocks. And is this a European woman with a hat, or is this an African woman, and are the people painting these caves basically African? Which would be inconceivable to Louis-Garon in 1920, but is not so inconceivable, because now we know from genetic studies of evolution, look at the dog. From the Great Dane to the little Yorkshire Terrier, they're all evolved from the wolf. They have all wolf DNA. So in a very short time of 10,000 years or so, with speciation in clades in various isolated circumstances, you can get enormous variation. So you can bleach out in the Ice Age where you're all covered up to protect yourself from the sun and you have no melanin in your skin, and a mutation of blue eyes comes in and gets captured in an isolated clade in Western Europe and doesn't spread to the rest of the world. So all the variations we see, we now know that race is a fiction, that basically in terms of DNA we're all basically the same, and that in the 19th century everything was race, 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 and into the 20th century, and race is just nonsense. It's a cultural construct. So it could be that what we're seeing is actually African art. Now here you have what I was talking about before. Here is the spirit chaser sign that is on the San petroglyph, and it's in front of this aurochs. This is not an animal that they hunt. This is probably a mythological narrative, and that what we see in Lascaux is a kind of Sistine Chapel of the Ice Age. Now, in some of the theories in which cognitive science is influencing the humanities, the French again have come up with the theory that these signs are actually what you see in trance states. If you close your eyes, you first see kind of little squiggles and patches, and then they coalesce into images, and then the images become little narratives and become dreams. And so in trance states, or what's called the hypnagogic state in cognitive science, there is a relationship between visionary shamanic cultures and psychological states of consciousness. So this chap, Jean-Claude and David Lewis Williams, who wrote a book on the mind of the cave, have developed a whole theory of the evolution of consciousness. Now, David Lewis Williams accepts the idea that there is this great divide between a Neanderthal and human, and he feels that Cromagnon could dream and have visionary trance states, but Neanderthals didn't dream. That's his thesis. It's a hard one to prove because, what would the data look like to prove that it's true? Here is one application of this from David Lewis Williams' book, The Mind in the Cave. On this side, it may be hard to see it crisply. These are what patients see in the laboratory with endoptic, meaning inside the eye with eyes closed. And these are the signs on the caves. So his thesis is that what is going on here is a ritual with trance states, and the animals are not realistically painted standing on the ground or in grass. They're visionary beings that are just floating in a kind of mental space on the wall, and you enter into a kind of participation, and the vision takes you over and you move into trance. And there probably was some, help and inducement of having mushrooms and psychedelic agents as well in shamanism. You don't need drugs to do it. You can do it through dehydration, through lack of sleep, because if you go without sleep, you'll begin to dream while you're awake, and in certain stages of delirium. I once had a kidney malfunction, and I began to be in delirious states, and I found that I could be dreaming and awake at the same time. And there would be some people in the room who were as vivid as the people who really were in the room in the hospital, but there were others who were there who weren't really there. But in terms of their ontological impact, I couldn't tell the ones who were real, and I had to keep asking the doctor, is there a guy playing the flute, outside in the courtyard? And he'd say no, and I'd say thank you. I could reality test against it. Because one cultural historian of the evolution of consciousness, the German Jean Gebser, had said early humanity was in the dream state. And I thought, well, how can you be in the dream state? If you're in the savannah, a leopard is going to chase you and eat you up. But by having this experience in delirium, I saw, what you do when you're awake and in the dream state at the same time is like a jazz musician. You riff on the physical image and you play it into a kind of personal narrative. Notice, if you've ever read Homer's Iliad, the anger of Achilles. When he gets angry at Agamemnon, he sees Athena, but nobody else there sees Athena, and Athena comes in and restrains him from killing Agamemnon, his king. So the dream state is called lucid dreaming, and a lot of religious experiences come out of this stage of lucid dreaming. If you go into a cave and you fast and you go without sleep, how could you not have a vision of the angel Gabriel? I mean, it's not surprising that the prophet has a vision. It would be surprising if he didn't, doing all that. So the whole application to this is the attempt to use cognitive science to understand what's really going on. In the first images of shamanism, we have forms that are half man. Here's kind of the world's first sculpture. And here in Chauvet, reindeer, and here bison. And they're both human and animal. And so there is an attempt to enter into a state of possession and project your body into the body of an animal. If you want to see a Hollywood version of this, get on Netflix Val Lewton's old classic black and white horror film called The Cat People. And it's all a story about this woman who is really shamanic and takes over the body of a black leopard. And so this whole notion of the werewolf, the leopard man, is a shamanic carryover into the modern world. Now, those of you who are from different cultures like China and India know that the body is not just the physical body that we think in the West. In Sanskrit, for example, there's the food body, the energy body, the chi body, the pranamaya kosa. Then there's the astral body, or the manomaya kosa. Kosa means sheath in Sanskrit. And then there's the nyingmaya kosa, and then the anatamaya, infinite body. So as you move into these subtle bodies, you move into hyperdimensionality. The meat body is just a three-dimensional object, but the subtle bodies are 4, 5, and n-dimensional. So the shaman is a person who can go into trance and project his vital body, the kind of acupuncture chi body, the energy body. In Homer, for example, so you can see there are all these different traditions around the world that recognize this. When someone is killed on the battlefield in the Iliad, he has a subtle body called the timos. It goes out through the nostrils and returns to the earth. And the earth is a kind of vital core of energy. And to be alive means you draw off this energy. And so when people are doing Tai Chi, for example, it's more effective if you attune to the chi energy of nature and you go into an auspicious place. If you're in a microwaved television studio, the Tai Chi won't be as effective if you're out in the park working with others. So different cultures around the world have recognized this. So the shaman is the person who has this capacity to shift consciousness from the three-dimensional meat body into the vital etheric body and project it into an animal. So suddenly, while he's doing this ritual, there are eagles flying above. I've seen this with Native Americans in the Southwest in America. Maybe you've seen it with the Navajo. Or they'll have a capacity to be able to relate to fearful animals like mountain lions or wolves and not be attacked. So this shamanic resonance with the animal spirits is definitely part of what shamanism is all about. Now, this is not just in Europe. This is Central America, and here is the shaman atop the jaguar flying in spirit space. So, some of you may have heard of the phrase out of the body. I'm having an out of the body experience. Have any of you heard this phrase? Astral projection, stuff like that. This is the trick of the shaman to go into trance and climb a ladder or project into space and move in another kind of cognitive domain that's a kind of reflection of the physical plane, but is different. For example, when my son, who is actually a cognitive science professor of philosophy of mind in Canada, when he was a little kid, I took him to Disneyland, and while we were looking at the display of Captain Nemo, the submarine, and all these hideous beings, came up and automated with, electronics and attacked the submarine. He got frightened, and I said, "Don't worry, it's not real." And then after the second one came up, I said, "Don't worry, it's not real." And he said, "Dad, are we real?" And so, you could definitely tell that the kid's going to grow up to be a philosopher. But that same summer when we had moved from, we were in LA instead of Toronto where I was teaching at the time, he had an experience where he left his body and he was flying over our rented farm in Ontario, and he saw our family dog being led out on a leash. And it really bothered him. The dog's name was Bridie, Belgian Shepherd. And he said, "Why is Bridie on a leash? Why is Bridie on a leash?" And he was woke up and he was very agitated. When we got back home, our neighbors who were taking care of the dog for us said, "Oh yes, we walked the dog in the backfield on a leash because Bridie had gone into heat, and we were afraid, the dog would get pregnant and you would be upset and angry." So his experience was reality tested against an external world, and so that's a very classic kind of shamanic experience. The ancient Scots had people with second sight. They would project out of the body, go south, see where the Scots were fighting the English, see that they had lost or won, come back to tell the people in northern Scotland, "We won, they'll be back tomorrow." So these are cultures that are basically shamanic. And in our modern scientific rational worldview, we dismiss all these things and say, no, this is just delusion. It's more complicated than that. So probably what's going on with all these footprints is that the hands and these early forms of blotches of red are actually a symbol of menarche and the woman having her first menstrual period, because what's most important in ancient art is blood. Red ochre. Everything is covered with red ochre. The first mineral to be traded in 70,000 BC is red ochre. When women in Africa go into menarche, they're covered with the color red. Temples are colored red in Manoa. Red is the sign of the blood of the Great Mother, and the Great Mother has the wound in resonance with the moon that heals itself. It bleeds, and then it heals itself. So the wounded healer is the shaman, but the primary image of the shaman is the female with the capacity of menstrual blood and the wound that heals itself. When there's a shift to patriarchy, it's no longer the female's ability to give life, it's the male's ability to take life. And the priest institute, with harmony with the warriors, human sacrifice. You don't have human sacrifice in the Ice Age. You get it in the Neolithic. So in this shift, blood is still the numinous archetypal symbol, but there's a radical, what Nietzsche would call a transvaluation of values from matristic female culture with the Great Mother to patriarchal culture and warriors and the ability to kill. But this is the Ice Age, and so these are probably the young girls who have transitioned to adulthood and are being initiated into the myths of the tribe. And these are the ones that are similar to what have been just discovered in Indonesia. Now here is the oldest artifact piece of art we have. This is 77,000 before the present, and it's from South Africa, and it's a piece of red ochre, the traded object, and it's inscribed with the triangle and the pubic delta of the Great Mother. Here you have it surviving for 70,000. This is 70,000. This is Neolithic Çatalhöyük with 5,800 before BCE. And if you've seen the Kali Yantra from India, you'll notice it has red triangle with a white dot. So this even survives into India, so it's pretty universal. This is the latest development in which this is a scene of the pit from Lascaux. Now, the realistic theory, like Dale Guthrie's book on the nature of Paleolithic art, which is incredibly simple-minded and linear and literal. Here is a man who was hunting this bison, and this is his spear, and the spear was impaled, and he got killed, and meanwhile a rhinoceros just happened to be walking by taking a crap. I mean, this is just absolute nonsense to read. This would be like saying Michelangelo Sistine Chapel is an old gay guy reaching out to seduce a young gay guy. I mean, this is just bullshit. I mean, you've got to be skeptical of this. These are, one of the myths of the Persians is the first man slayed the first animal, and of his blood the universe was created. So this is probably a mythological narrative and not a literal narrative, and you can't see it because it's so dark. This is not the bowels of a disemboweled bison, this is a vulva symbol, and the spear is a male phallic symbol. And this guy obviously is not your realistic, he's a bird man, which is a symbol of the shaman, and he's ithyphallic, which is a fancy Greek word for having an erection, and this indicates that he's in trance state, because males have erections not just with sex, but in terms of rapid eye movement of the dreaming state, or what's called the hypnagogic. So this is probably a whole map of the heavens, and this bird on a stick is a gnomon for measuring the shadow, like the gnomon on the point of a sundial, that measures the shadow of the sun to determine the equinox for fall and spring. This is in German a monograph on prehistory of the knowledge of the heavens and the paleoastronomical methodology. A heavenly chart from the Ice Age. So what you have with this cosmology is sexuality as a cosmology. That it is yin and yang, and it is the female is space and the male is time, and the male is as transitory and evanescent as the erection, and the female is eternal return and the wound that heals itself. So there are two modalities of time, the female modality and the male modality. So you have lunar and menstrual synchrony, so you'll see the goddess with the moon in a minute. But you have the arithmetic mentality in which it's not just number, it's also generation. So-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. How does the female generate difference and can give birth to the male? The female equals space, the male equals time. Female is enduring, male is transient. There is the eternal goddess and the dying god. So the temple is often the body of the Great Mother in the female, and into it statues of the male are deposited as a sign of the king who must die to fructify the crops. And so this is an ancient Neolithic that's part of the transition from Ice Age to agriculture. Now, shamanism is a very different complex than religion. It's not, the priest is chosen by men, by institutions, but the shaman is chosen by spirits in a power vision. So if they see that you're a kind of special kid who can go into trance more easily than other people, you go off into the woods by yourself and you have your power vision. Your animal spirit or your guardian spirit comes to you, gives you a new name, and gives you your purpose in life, and you return to the community now empowered as a shaman or as a special one chosen by the gods or the spirit. To be a priest, you're supported by an economic surplus. It's an institution. You study, you pass exams, and you get out of seminary, and holy water is sprinkled on you, and you're a priest. But a shaman is a very different kind of creature. So here's one of the earliest artifacts that shows the hand reaching out to touch the cave bear spirit, and this is a kind of initiatic symbol of the expansion of the human consciousness into the animal spirit and the two becoming one. So here you can see how incredibly conservative, because this from Hohe 33,000, one of the oldest artifacts, and it goes on for 13,000 years. And here's the Venus of Lespugue. Now, Ralph Abraham is my colleague, founding mentor of the Ross School, a mathematician. And I said, look how stylized this is. Is there a mathematical ratio of the length of the head to the midsection, to the breast, to the hips, to the legs? It's pointed so they can stick it in the hearth or a dirt altar. And on the back, it sort of looks like almost like a lute with these strings that are tied to a common point. Ralph studied the proportions and scanned it into his computer and determined, Ralph is a mathematician at the University of California at Santa Cruz, Ralph Abraham, determined that it was a musical scale. Here you have the goddess with the lunar calendar of 13, and here is the crescent moon, and here is the red ochre that's been daubed over it. This kind of form is used later to gather the grasses with the crescent sickle by women in the shift from gathering grains to agriculture. And here are the phases of the moon with the first markings of the Ashanga stick. Now here is what Ralph did with measuring the Heptaonic scale and seeing that there is a canon. The Greeks had a thing called the canon of Praxiteles. Did you cover that in art history here? That's where there is a ratio, what is it? Is it 8 to 1 or something? The ratio of the head to the length of the body in Greek sculpture. So all sculpture would follow this classical canon of Praxiteles. Ralph's point is there is a Paleolithic canon, and that is the musical scale, because we know the first tool we've ever found was in China, which was a flute with 5 holes indicating a musical scale. So the musical instruments are the first technology. So it's another way of saying art is important. Now again, this is on the web, so go to Ralph Abraham's web page and you'll get the paper that explains all this. So here you have this incredible continuity over millennia. Here is Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, Turkey, of Demeter and Persephone, the maiden and the matron, the double goddess. Here it is from Palestine with Ain Ghazal, and here it is from Valdivia in coastal Ecuador. When I was in the site in Bolivia of Tiwanaku, the Indians were selling a little piece of stone with two heads coming out of it, just exactly like this or like this. And I said, what is that? And they said, Pachamama. This is the Great Mother and her daughter. So it's spread all over. Now, one of the strange things of the imperial narrative is how patriarchal it is, because archaeologists will stay at Harvard and Oxford. There's no evidence of a matristic culture. That's all New Age goddess worship. It's all nonsense. And Stephen Mithen, in his book on After the Ice, said there is no evidence at Göbekli Tepe of any goddess statues. Well, of course not, because the form of the temple is itself the body of the woman. Look here at Ishtar with this form, and look here at the temples of Malta, or look at the pottery with the same form. Here is in England, the West Kennet Long Barrow, and the temple itself is the body of the Great Mother. So you would put in it the symbol of transitory time, the dying male. You wouldn't expect to see statues of the goddess in there, because the temple itself is the goddess. But do they see that? No, they just dismiss Maria Gambuta's work on the goddess and saying that's all New Age nonsense. So here you see the goddess with the crescent moon going. This is an image that goes back to the Venus of Lascaux of 14,000 BC. Here she is over the crescent moon with her feet upon the snake. Well, that's in Catholicism the symbol that the Virgin Mary has conquered original sin with her Immaculate Conception, and she's putting down the devil of the serpent. But the original form is the goddess with the serpent. So they're quoting something ancient, but they're transvaluating it, making your point, Terry. So here is the goddess with the snakes in her hand, and here is Ishtar, and both the Canaanite and the Mesopotamian. So even in our contemporary religion, some of these images survive. And in this poem to the goddess, she describes her vulva as like a horn or the crescent. And here is, in Iraq, the crescent reed boat. And here is one from Lake Titicaca that I took in 1975. All right, so this is a whole other lecture to come on Neolithic. But here you see the great oryx of the bull, and here you see it on the wall. So it goes from cave painting to wall painting. And here you see this pubic delta with the white dot that's similar to the piece of ochre that I showed you. So at that point, I will stop, and we can have question and answer or whatever you'd like to do.